Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. I am thrilled you are here with us today. Our purpose is to share stories, ideas, and tools to help you on your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Let's meet this week's guest. Hello. We are back with a special guest today, Farzana Nayani. And she is the author of one of my new favorite reads on DEI, The Power of Employee Resource Groups, How People Create Authentic Change. A lot more that she has done. Farzana is recognized for diversity, equity, and inclusion work. As a business and strategy coach and international keynote speaker, she's worked with Fortune 500 companies, public agencies, higher ed institutions, school districts, and nonprofits as a consultant and trainer on DEI. Her advisory work with employee resource groups, small business advocacy and entrepreneurship, and racial equity and inclusion has taken her to engagements across North America, from the White House to Silicon Valley. And she's been featured on a lot of publications. One of her previous books that I just love is Raising Multicultural Children, Tools for Nurturing Identity in a Racialized World. And so excited to have you with us, Farzana. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Julie, for having me. And I'm so excited to be here as well.
Yeah. Well, I want to dig into ERGs, employee resource groups. How did you think of focusing on this in your work? Because DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion is so many spigots you can go down. Why did you choose to focus on employee resource groups?
Well, it definitely was something that came up over and over again in my DEI consulting work, in coaching, and even when I do keynote speaking. And what I saw was that a lot of companies had really great resources within. So they would have annual reports, or they would even have networks where they'd crowdsource with other companies that they'd know. But I was really hoping to see, what resources could be made that are accessible for the general public to just get a primer on it. And there's such great academic research and a lot of people doing work in the space for years. So the goal of this book is really to highlight and complement all of that, but to make it an easy read, something that people can just pick up and kind of get the lowdown, and really to support ERG leaders and members, because they're the ones doing the tremendous work of volunteering or giving their time. And a lot of them are new to the work. So with all of that in mind, that's the spirit of what this book is all about.
Yeah, no, I can understand. It's still a burning topic. Sometimes you think when doing this work for a long time that every organization has employee resource groups, or sometimes, business resource groups, affinity groups, whatever they call them. And then I'll stumble on an organization that is just getting them started or thinking about it. And I'm like, we're still there. Okay. So I'm curious, for organizations that maybe haven't started them with good reason. Hey, it's never too late to join the party. What advice would you have for jumpstarting an employee resource group? What are the critical things for success?
You make a really good point, Julie, that different organizations have a range of experience with ERG. Some are brand new, some have had them forever. And I think that as people are starting out forming ERGs, I understand the caution around them. And my advice is to really plan for sustainability in the long game. Definitely, there's a lot of excitement in reaction to different reasons, causes, and the news to form ERGs in response to tragedies or to uplift a community. And I completely believe in that. However, at the same time, if there isn't the infrastructure in place or even the support needed for employee resource groups to continue, then they are, destined to fail. And I don't mean that to be negative. I mean that to be realistic, to make sure that we're supporting our employees and professionals who are doing the work, and also to make sure it's hitting the organizational objectives so that it can be sustainable and can thrive. So that's what I would say, is to just think about the goals as they're being created.
Yeah. And I know you have a nice 5 Ps model in the book too. Just help. I think frameworks really help when you're starting this. I always recommend, like you said, goals, have executive sponsorship, have ability to measure success. Like, what if, what do the goals look like? Like, how are we going to measure that? And it's not just, hey, we're going to do events. I think that's what a lot of ERGs fall into the pitfall of. And then after a year, they're like, I don't know what else to talk about. And it doesn't feel very intentional. And to your point, I mean, this is an opportunity to uplift marginalized, underrepresented groups. What kind of employee resource groups? I'm seeing a lot of creative ones lately. Working parents has been an interesting one that I know you feel really passionate about that topic as well. That's been a fun one that I've been plugging in with more in organizations. What are some other fun ERG centers or dimensions of diversity are you seeing organizations focus on?
Well, I think it's good to distinguish between employee resource groups and affinity groups, or gatherings of people. Sometimes there are networks that are created and they're not specifically ERGs or have that structure. So those are hobbies. People like to do cycling or any type of craft or some other type of interest. And I think I've seen companies really delineate what is an employee resource group and what is an affinity group. So the ones that I've seen that I think kind of encompass an intermingling of identity, interest, and uniqueness are, for example, at some alcohol-based beverage companies, they have employee resource groups for people who don't drink alcohol, which if you think about it, makes a lot of sense because in that community, they are a marginalized group. And so for health reasons, or if you're pregnant, or if maybe you had a battle with alcoholism in the past, you need support. And if you're working in a company where it's normal to have a beverage, usually they have company policy that you can have a beverage with a meal at lunch, that type of thing, then that group is needed. There's definitely an explosion around neurodiversity, which I think is really important to note because that is something that is an overlooked cause in community and demographic, yet it's something that's persistent and has been a constant part of our professional community since the beginning of work and time. It just hasn't been named that way. And what I also love is the growth of the working parent groups that you mentioned. Yes, I absolutely feel very connected to that, being a parent myself. But I'm also seeing a lot of interest in the multiracial community and have spoken at different organizations and have supported their formation of the mixed race, mixed ERGs, to help support the identities that cross different monoethnic or monoracial groups and maybe need that separate space. And that can include transracial adoptees as well if people feel inclined to join that. So I've seen a lot of really exciting things, and it's such a great question to reflect on as we continue in this space.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know the subject of multiracial, like that's just it, just like neurodiversity, like these are going to continue to be conversations as this next generation enters the workforce and brings with it a ton more of conversation about this and representation of those types of diversity. So I'm excited to see more of that as well. I'm curious, Farzana, thinking about your work with your previous book on raising multiracial children, I'd love for you to weigh in on and what brought you into that work, your own lived experiences, or just your own vantage point on that as well.
I've done a lot of work and reflection and research on the multiracial community. I identify myself as multi-ethnic. My mother's from the Philippines, my father's from Pakistan, and his mother's from India. So I'm South Asian and Filipina, and my kids are mixed race. So my partner is Malaysian and German. And when you have this perspective and this type of family growing up and also raising your own, you're so conscious of what feedback is given to not only yourself, but those around you, what type of identity is being formed. And I think as we think about not only children, but adults in the workforce, how are people covering who they are in order to fit into a monoracial or monoethnic group? And how are, sometimes the microaggressions experienced differently? Because if someone doesn't know that you're of a certain background, they might say something in front of you. Or it can also happen where people say, well, you're not enough because you're a certain skin type or you're a certain hair texture, right? And then people can feel a sense of lack and they don't feel comfortable. So I've been an advocate for awareness around that. Again, also to uplift, Black, Indigenous people of color, but also to look at how we can incorporate a really inclusive sense around these identities to be more, mindful and to have belonging around everyone. And that's something that I think I'm seeing also with the employee research groups is I'm really calling in the need to uplift. Like, let's say in the Asian community, we have a lot of different types of ethnicities. There's a huge mixed race population and also transracial adoptees. So when you have an experience of being Asian Pacific Islander, what does that mean to you? It can mean multiple different things. So multitude of different things. So what's hard is when we have just one lens on what a demographic group is. We're very busy and in support of raising awareness around the group itself, but then within the group there's so much diversity. We're seeing so much awareness being raised around that, and I can't say enough about how much heart I have towards unpacking that complexity and nuance to identity.
Yeah. And having that conversation with kiddos about all those different identities that are within you. And what that means for how the conversations you have with your friends. And like you said about transracial adoptions, like that's just a conversation that hasn't historically been mainstream, right? And so how to have that conversation, because certainly those conversations are going to present themselves a lot more with just the growing demographics that are shifting here in the United States and around the world. I'm curious, shifting back to ERGs, you said something interesting about people coming into the workplace and feeling like they're not enough of this, they're not enough of this. And so how ERGs can be like that safe place for me to feel like I can be my full self. And for some folks, that's really the only time at work they can feel fully out to be who they really are. I'm curious though, because ERGs, as you reflect in your book, it's not just about the workplace, right? Ideally, we would leverage ERGs in our communities and in external communications as well, and really to drive innovation too of our products, making sure they're fully represented. So I'm just curious to build off of that, Farzana, like what would you add to organizations that might just be internally focused with our employee resource groups? How do you broaden it a bit more?
Yes, a great question. So, to start internally, the people that are part of the organization may feel a need for more belonging because they might be a minority group. And so, easily we look at the workforce and workplace as outcomes for why employee research groups are effective and how they
Mhm.
can be. As we're looking at externally how that can be applied, it also leads to the marketplace and how we can reach communities that we're trying to address with our products and services, causes themselves, and also what I like to call supplier diversity and engagement of business owners that are maybe veteran owned or LGBTQ plus owned or Black owned business, et cetera. So what we're seeing is a real understanding of a greater reach of ERGs and the output that can happen. And I have a model in the book that talks about the pillars around workforce, workplace, marketplace, community, and supplier diversity. And in addition to that, I think, employee resource groups also offer a healing space for many of us. I was facilitating a large employee resource group day, and one of our breakout sessions was with the Latinx group. And within that session, I witnessed a lot of sharing around people not knowing the language, or some people being darker skinned or lighter skinned, or some people being immigrants versus being American born, et cetera. And there was this need to have this conversation within the community in order to galvanize around their identity because that hadn't been processed yet. There's a lot of tears flowing, a lot of heartfelt conversations, and a lot of support given. And I think that strengthened not only that group, but their connection and engagement with the organization to be able to have that space to be themselves and feel authentic. So I think that there's a lot of unpacking and processing we can do within our own groups, as well as, thinking about allies and how allies can be a part of the conversation and support uplifting these communities as well.
Oh, perfect segue. Allies. I'm passionate. And we talk about that a lot on this podcast. How do ERGs successfully integrate allies into, because there's a, there's a special time for it to be my experience and to not be in the mainstream, broader culture. It's like that safe place time, but there's also the time when it makes sense to have a broader conversation about how folks can be helpful to underrepresented groups. So just curious how to bring in allies successfully.
People have staunch opinions about this, Julie, because some people think every event should be open to all, and maybe there could be some events that are only open for some people all the time, right? Um, and I think the key is balancing that out. So, trying to preserve space for the identity group that the ERG is serving is really important. Like I said, sometimes you need to have those in group conversations and processing, and that's not meant for allies. At the same time, having allies in the reach and support of people who are not a part of the demographic can be very powerful and advantageous, and also contribute to the longevity of the group. So I do recommend having both. Now, that being said, by law, we cannot exclude anyone from anything. So there's a way to position the communications, and I work with organizations around this in order to be respectful and honor this space, but also to make sure we're not excluding people. So if people do want to come, they can. However, we say that a space is centered on or intended for, etc. So there's ways that you can indicate that without making it seem like this is exclusive. So I think there's, again, a lot of nuance to that, and definitely we need a greater focus on this, because it is something that all organizations are navigating. And then add another group, which is people who think that these spaces shouldn't exist at all, and why do we have them? And that's a conversation in itself around how to effectively address resistance. I have a model in my book around what I call the DEI stakeholder composition of an organization. So you have people who are champions, you have people who are learning, you have people who are obstructionists, as I call them. And I think we need to factor in that there are people in kind of all parts of the spectrum, and not everyone is on board. And maybe some people just need to understand in order for them to connect to it.
Not everyone is an ally yet. Yeah, and I think
Yes.
it speaks to, like, legally, yes, you do have to have, like, you can't be exclusionary, which is, obviously counter to inclusion, so you would hope not. But I think being really intentional about the purpose. And this goes back to what you were saying earlier with a successful ERG. They have goals, they have a statement of purpose, they have a mission, why you exist. And so that's super crystal clear to folks, and you're consistent about that. You're less likely to have the disruptors or folks, coming that aren't on board. So being super intentional, I think, with your mission as an ERG, and finding the allies around, the people with women's ERGs back in the day. There used to be a guy or two that would come to, like, the conference or the thing, and they're like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be here, but I have daughters, and it's that kind of stuff. And it's like, oh geez,
Right.
come a long way. I mean, now there's many more men that understand, like, oh, okay, this isn't a woman's issue for her to fix. And conversely, across the dimensions of diversity, we need folks in positions of power and influence to participate. And they're going to use that power and influence for positive change. So important there. I'm curious, Rosanna, about you talked a bit about measurement in the book and how to measure the success of employee resource groups, because some employee resource groups, folks get paid to be a part of it most of the time. It's voluntary, air quotes, work, invisible work, a lot of times too, not promotable work, which is a whole nother set of problems. But for folks that want to know, okay, I want to show that this is important to the business, to the organization, that this is having a positive impact, what kind of things should be measured?
This is an ongoing issue and area of attention, and it is specific to each organization. What I will say is that sometimes we just start and stop with attendance, and that's just not enough. People count how many members they have, who's in there, and then who comes to events. And back in the day when we were all meeting in person, I know companies would have the swipe, the badge in numbers, and then companies would actually determine budgets based on how many people badged in at an event. And some ERGs would have more money or less money based on that, believe it or not. Now, we are in a new land and world with hybrid connectivity. and experiences of work. And at the same time, how do we be equitable if there are some groups that just generally have less people, again, due to systemic inequity, because they didn't get into the organization in the first place? So all of these metrics are on the table to be examined and called into question. I do think that as a part of planning, one thing is to look at what your objectives are and see if there can be metrics based on that. So, for example, if you want to see employees rise through the ranks or be promoted, and there's a way to track that, that is a great metric. I was talking with the tech company, and that's something that they were interested in. Other ways to look at the experiences of people as a qualitative measure could be through a survey, an employee satisfaction pulse survey, or any type of other evaluation like that. That can actually give you a lot of data, and the ERGs themselves have access to people of the specific groups. So I think that there are ways that you can combine different metrics. A call into the 5Ps model that I have in the book, which talks about purpose, talks about the people involved, the processes that are part of the ERG, how we prioritize and plan. You can base metrics on all of that. So I think when we, as you said, you focus on events and have fun and do the Samosa Day, or the Dragon Boat Festival, or Juneteenth, without any external understanding of the depth of that. I like events. I think they're great. Social events are important. Historic events are absolutely key. And at the same time, in order for the ERG to be seen as something of value, hate to put it that way, but that's necessary in an organization, there has to be a metric associated with that. And I think we can really examine what we have and be creative about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Creativity beyond events and have measurement. I love the swiping, the old days when we got in rooms together. But now, I mean, Zoom and most platforms, I think you can download an attendee list too. So like track these things, like surveys, like see what people like, what they don't like, what they want more of, what they want less of. And so much of it too, I think where ERGs can live beyond events. Most of us, not all of us being in a hybrid world, can get that Zoom fatigue, that virtual meeting fatigue. And so finding other ways to bring content to folks, because so much of the gap is education and story sharing too, for folks that are in the ERG. What a great opportunity for them to share more about their culture, their upbringing, personal details if they felt comfortable sharing. I just love that. I love, and it really has to be done in a way that's authentic. So I know some of my clients will share like, they'll do like a cuisine, feature on like, this is like the kind of food that we make at our house, or, and not in a tokenized way, like in a very genuine way, a better understanding of our culture through something like food or film, or, obviously books and things like that too. I'm curious in wrapping up today, Farzana, what is one nugget, like one thing we haven't talked about with employee resource groups or your field of expertise that you would really want to leave our listeners with?
I think we absolutely have to center people. And I know that that makes intuitive sense, but really sometimes we look at organizations as systems and have ERGs function to be leveraged. I'm doing air quotes with my fingers around the talent that they provide and the insights that they offer. However, people themselves need help right now and support. And we're in a time of still this pandemic and the ongoing reckoning around racial equity. There's still moments of anti-blackness and anti-Asian racism, and if we're looking at LGBTQ plus legislation, et cetera, right? Like our rights are being challenged. And I think there's a need for healing, a need for the emotional support, and a need for understanding that there are people behind these groups that we care for. So that would be the bottom line that I'd like us to remind ourselves about and leave us with.
Yeah. Work is human. We're human beings. We're bringing our full human self. Well, if we can, to the workplace. That was always the case, but I think we really realized that over the last couple of years. And you're right. I was reading a report recently just about AAPI. I think it kind of, goes up and down in the news cycle, but the amount of hate crimes that have been reported, let alone the ones that haven't been reported over the last few years, is terrifying. The
Right.
amount, and that's just something that we have to keep talking about and addressing. It's just unacceptable. And racial justice work, like that wasn't just for the summer of 2020. Like we got to keep talking about
Exactly.
it. And I know you and I are passionate about taking this conversation home and having it with kiddos too, because if we don't talk about it now, then they're going to enter the workforce with the same guys, at least that I had, of like everything's equal and maybe not so much.
Great point.
Thanks so much for your work, for your voice, for your books, for sharing your time with us today. Farzana, how can our audience stay in touch with you?
Thank you, Julie, for having me. And so great to be here and be with the audience. Folks can keep in touch with me through LinkedIn. It's my first and last name. That's a really great way to see what I'm up to. Also, my website, farzananayani.com, has an email list and a lot of great resources. And I'm currently launching a new site called ergdynamics.com, which is focused on employee resource groups. We've got an Instagram going, Facebook going for that. So stay tuned for more news around ERGs. And, as always, I'm doing a lot of work in the multiracial community. I have an Instagram called Multiracial Matters. So a lot of fun stuff that I'm involved with and passionate about. And I'm so appreciative to share that with everyone here today.
Yay! Well, we'll link to that in the show notes. And so thankful for your voice out in the world. Farzana, thanks for spending the time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Allies are necessary for positive change. If you are on the journey to becoming an ally, we invite you to participate in our brand new Lead Like an Ally online program or get a copy of our new book, Allyship in Action, available on Amazon. Both are helpful tools that meet leaders where they're at and help provide tools for professional and personal settings. Head over to nextpivotpoint.com to get started today.